Right, so today we're going to be taking a look at some fishing reels. Now, I would have more videos up of fish, but we've had so many storms. I mean, we've got, what, 2 months now, and it's just been raining, storms, gales, just consistent. So, I thought, well, let's take a look at reels instead, until we can get out and get some more filming done with the fishing. Right, so where do we start? We'll start with this one. Now, this reel here is, I believe it's a Garcia Mitchell. This thing is probably from somewhere around about the 70s, I would have thought. It's a very old reel. It's actually my father's reel, but he doesn't use it anymore. It's, well, you can see basically, I mean, this thing is still going. I still use this actually. I've used it, you might see it in some of the videos actually on the boat. It still gets used, it still works perfectly fine. Not the sort of reel you'd probably try and use for casting. If you do, it just explode and you'll end up with the biggest bird nest ever. But you can see how they built them back then. I mean, you're talking chromed brass. Very good reels, you know, still working to this day, still solid, a little bit loose, but nothing more than that. And as long as they kept greased and that, they last for years, these old reels, you know. They're heavy. But on a boat, they're perfectly fine. The only thing you do find is that where you've got the spool here, and it goes against the casing, you've got to be careful you don't get the line caught in there. I mean, today with modern lines, they're much, much thinner these days, and they can end up getting there because obviously the machining isn't as tight as what it can be these days. So that's the only thing you've got to watch for them. There's no level wind on this. Personally, I don't use level winds. I do have them on some reels, but I take them off all my shore reels. I've just done it for so long, naturally using my thumb to put it on, and for casting you get a much further cast when you don't have them on, so that's the reason not. And we've got another one here. This one is actually the first reel, or boat reel, I ever bought myself when I was a kid. This is 30 odd years old, this thing, and it still works again. It's an old Olympus DS1. You probably won't even be able to find one of these anymore. Like I say, it works fine. It's a little bit rattly and that, of course, you know, it's 30 years old and it's been used a lot. This is a replacement. Originally this was a chrome piece here, but I actually lost it when I was a kid. I think it might have dropped over the side. And my dad's friend actually machined this up for me, a new one, which works perfectly fine. It's been there ever since. It's just a solid bit of brass. And now this has a slightly different setup because you see the level wind here, this thing here, see if we can move it in. It's not your traditional, it just is a twist bar, but it works perfectly fine. It doesn't have any gears, any rolling back and forth like the modern ones, and there is nothing wrong with that. When I first had it, I thought, I wonder if that's going to work out, but it works perfectly fine. And it's such a simple system. But no, this has been a very good reel. Like I say, still usable to this day. I don't use it much because it's quite a bulky reel, and you know, it is getting a little bit loose. But everything on it works fine still. Oh, well, the spring's got in that, but that often quite happens with older reels. So, going on to this type, this is a pen reel. Pen reels are very, very good. I mean, they're basically brass with stainless steel, and they got graphites or whatever they use. And they're a solid reel, and they're a very reliable reel, and they take a lot of, you know, beatings when it comes to salt water and that. There is a slight flaw with them, and it's nothing too problematic, and it's this lever here. It actually has a spring and inside here, and the spring is stainless, but what tends to happen is the spring tends to break, and then you have to set it back manually. You can't wind it back or with the spring firing it back. As long as you take it out, you can just do it manually. It's not a big problem. The other thing the 320 GT ones had was that the spool gets very tight. So like when you pull the line, I don't know if I can do it on this one because it's tied up, but when you pull the line off, this spool, I mean, that's set as light as possible, and I could just about pull it off, which is fine with heavy line. If I was using light line, I'd have a problem. But it does pull off, but it's just very stiff. Now I had another one, exactly the same, and the spool is basically completely seized up. I've even tried hammering it free, and it just will not free, so I've had to use it as spare parts for this one. But yeah. Good all-round reel though, and good solid boat reel that. This is another pen. This is a slightly different one. It used to have a counter on it, but I took that off and cut it off basically. Works fine, and this is funny actually because this reel is quite old and the spring went in here. This one was barely a year old, same thing, the spring broke in here. It's a different type, but same thing happens with it, the spring breaks. And I think nearly every one I've owned, the spring is gone. And that's probably just the fact it's made of stainless, which is a good thing in a way, but stainless is a lot tougher, and it's obviously easier to break. You know, it gets brittle. You get it with screws sometimes, where you screw a screw and the head comes off on stainless. So that's the only thing. It's not as flexible as the steel. But like I say, all in all, very, very good reels. This is a slightly cheaper one. It's again, the level wind's been taken off. This actual level wind actually stopped working or became problematic, so I removed it. But like I say, it doesn't bother me not having a level wind on it. Apart from that, again, very good reel. Now, there's another one. This is Ambassador. This is a shore reel, 6500 C3. This one. It's an old reel, and it still goes to this day. This was a very reliable reel. In fact, prior to this one, I used to have an Abu 6, and that lasted for years. It was the best reel I've ever had, basically, as far as a shore multiplier goes. This one lasted for many years as well. Like I said, it's a pretty old one, this. I think they were making these in the 90s. They still make them as far as I know, but it was made in the 90s. And then I had this one. This was a later one. Now, this is a synchro, which has got a handle which you basically just wind back, and that sets your drag. So the fish, when you put your rod down, so the fish can take the line. And when you do that, it just tightens up, and this is obviously your settings here to adjust it. Again, there is a small problem with these reels, and that is this. Again, this bar that goes down. There's not the bar, sorry. There's when the reel goes backwards or forwards, there's a little piece of metal in there which stops the reel going backwards against the cogs. And as you can see there, it breaks. And nearly every one of these I've ever had, at some point that thing goes inside because it's quite flimsy. This one, you'll see it works perfectly fine. This one is a little bit more, it works, but it's not brilliant. But I've actually made the pieces myself inside now for that. Originally, there's a little, it's like a little plate with two bits of brass either side, which makes it drop onto a cog, and then it can't wind backwards. But for some reason they get chewed up and they don't work anymore. It doesn't happen straight away. Your reel lasts, you know, quite a few years before they go. But I ended up cutting out and making a brand new piece, and it's actually been a lot better since I've taken that other one out and put the, you know, the new fabricated piece in. So we've got those two, and I will just go and grab another one. Okay, so I just went and got this one. This is a Fladden one. It's a Surf Chieftain. It's actually quite a cheap reel. I think these are about 40 quid, I think. But it works perfectly fine. This one is actually 2 years old, so they do last a certain amount of time. The only thing that's gone wrong with this, and it actually went with about the first 3 trips or something daft, is on the side here. This makes it click. Obviously, when your line pulls off, you'll hear it clicking off. This broke. It's just a bit of metal in there, bendy bit of metal which rubs against a cog. But the thing is, I mean, I've tried setting it back, but I never could get it quite right. But as far as that goes, I mean, the reel works perfectly fine, not a problem. This is actually something I look for as well quite often, is when they've been riveted, because I have had welded reels before which break, not this particular make, but in the Abu range, and so I prefer them when they've actually put rivets on. Yeah, I mean, this is, like I say, a cheap reel. It works perfectly fine. It works perfectly well for shore. I use this one mostly daytime and off the boat now because of the that clicky thing not working at night. You can't hear your line running off, although I do have another one of these which is a year old, and this still works. It's never had a problem with anything. So there you go. That's, like I say, a cheap reel. Now you see this one here. This is obviously the Ambassador, the Abu Garcia 6500. Now this is where I stopped actually buying these. I used to always, I mean, I had the Abu 6. I've had several of these, and obviously this one, which is another one, which is just the synchro version. Now I stopped because I actually bought the 7000. Now I had a couple of those 7000 ones, and a friend had one, and they lasted pretty much something like a month or 2 months. They were absolute rubbish. Now, I mean, I would have said, well, maybe it was, you know, just the odd one, because it can happen that, you know, you get a duff reel, but no, out of those 3-4 reels, there might have even been another friend was saying he had problems with his. They were just rubbish, and I mean, when you actually opened them up, they started using plastic gears in them. So, I mean, I don't know, I think they started making them abroad, and obviously the parts went downhill, and wasn't impressed. And since then, I've never actually bought another Abu Garcia. I mean, did alright, you know, up to this age, these were brilliant reels. And then as we get later on, they started either using cheaper parts or moving their production factory abroad or whatever. But I stopped buying them after I had you know, I mean, these things aren't cheap. They're what, 120 quid or something for the Abu reels? And, you know, you pay 120 quid and you get a reel that lasts 2 months. And, you know, I can buy that for 40 quid. So in effect, I could buy 3 of these reels. And this has lasted 2 years. Yeah, this one's 2 years. The other one I've got is a year old. And, you know, they're still going. So, I mean, they might only last 2-3 years, maybe 4 years even. But that's still long enough for 40 quid. You know, if a 40 quid reel lasts a year, you know, 2 years. I mean, it gets heavy use. You can see this is quite beat up, you know. It's been through the wars. And it still works fine. You know, I can't justify going out and buying another one of these if it's going to last me a month or 2 months or even 6 months and it costs me 120 quid. There's just no way. And with these, the other side of it is if you buy, say you go out and buy one of these, you buy 3 of these for the same price as this, then if one of these does go wrong, you've got all the spare parts you need for the other ones, so you can keep them running for even longer. And that is why I don't bother with the Abus anymore, which is a shame because I used to really like them. And I mean, I'm sure there are some very good ones out there, but after having a couple of really bad ones, I just, you know, don't want to take the chance because they are, you know, they're not a cheap reel. So I mean, you get like with the big boat ones, the Penn, they've always been reliable, and they still are even to this day. You know, you're always going to get bad ones or the odd thing going wrong, but generally they're solid, they work. You can leave this on the boat in an open boat, obviously chained up, but on the boat all year, bring it in, wash it, and it'll be as good as for the next year. And you can, you know, they just take such a beating. And if you want to see some really bad reels, here's one here. This is just pure garbage. It's cheap. I mean, you can see it's cheap. It's just a very cheap multiplier. You can buy these sort of things. This one lasted around about 3 days. That one, before it stops working. What happens is you can't put it into gear. Basically, you let the line out, you go like that, and it just doesn't do anything. It's just knackered. The whole thing is just awful. And when you actually look at the construction of it closely, I mean, it's just nasty. Wouldn't recommend buying any one of these. I mean, there could be some good ones. Again, this could just be a Jonah. It could just be a one-off. But to be honest, looking at it, no. But then again, it's a cheap reel. You expect to buy one of these, use it for a year, and then chuck it in the bin. Moving on to fixed spools. And while we're talking of garbage, here's another one. Now this is actually the same make as this one, which is a Fladden, and this is a Chieftain, this is a Chieftain. This is fine, this works perfectly good. Has lasted for several years. This one lasted 1 trip. Literally. I mean, it just, again, absolute rubbish. And the spool, I think, is plastic. I mean, it's on the cheap range. It's even got a different handle, I think, because the handle rotted away on this one. Yeah, it's just, the back there's gone, there's a thing here, it's come off, it's just, I mean, I ended up using it, I tried using it a second time for float fishing, and that's when it finally just packed up. 2 trips. I mean, just an absolute piece of garbage. So, don't ever buy really cheap, because you'll end up with this sort of thing, and it won't last at all. But then again, I wouldn't buy expensive either if I can avoid it, you know. I mean, okay, the Pens maybe, but generally I stay away from expensive reels these days because a lot's changed. Years ago you could buy an expensive reel and you got some real quality. I find nowadays you buy expensive reels and they've got the same parts. I mean, they're using plastic bits, trying to cut down on cost, use cheaper parts, and you just end up with a lot of, you know, rubbish in there, which doesn't last. You know, what you really probably want to go for is mid-range is normally the best. Again, another fixed spool. This is a mid-range one. You know, it's got corrosion on the handle there where it's all white. It's beaten up. But this has done, what has this done? 3 years? it still works. It's still quite smooth. The one thing I avoid with these quite often actually is when you see them and they say, I mean this one says it's got 6 ball bearings, which is something I normally avoid. I normally go for just a couple of ball bearings in a reel, because usually when these things seize up or anything, it's because the ball bearings have got water in them, or salt water, and they rot basically and seize. So the more ball bearings you've got in it, the more chance they have of seizing. So, you know, if your reel takes a dunk, I mean I had a friend bought one a while back and he bought a really expensive one from a local tackle shop. And I believe probably what happened, we were fishing for bass, wading, and I think when he caught a fish he put his rod back, which is probably everybody's done at some point, and it ended up in the water, like without him really knowing about it. A week later it came to go fishing and his whole reel was just completely seized and we couldn't free it. The bearings had literally rusted up in a week, and that was on a really expensive reel with, I think he said he had 7, 8, 11, 12 with bearings in it and all this fancy stuff. So again, you've got to watch that. Don't get too carried away with how many bearings and things are in it, because it can end up causing you more problems. So obviously if you get one that's got no bearings, well, it's not going to last. So, so anyway, that was a fairly good one. Now we got a few of these. These are really old actually. This is a Shimano. Now everybody knows Shimano gearing is fantastic, so you're going to get a lovely smooth reel with Shimano. They're well built, and price wise I don't really know. I think they're quite expensive, but again, Shimano's always been about gears. You get them on bikes and all sorts, so obviously you're going to get a nice smooth reel. This is just a little one actually. This one's been doing river, lake fishing, that kind of thing, and it's probably been down to the beach a couple of times, so it's in fairly good nick. It's not the sort of, I don't tend to use these little reels so much from the shore, only when I'm messing around, maybe for pollock. And we've got this one. This one is an unknown. I say an unknown, it says EC on it. It's just a knocked out reel from wherever, but it's lasted for years, and this one has been down. I've used this quite a few times fishing from the shore, just off piers and things, and it's works perfectly fine, and it was a really cheap reel, so it just goes to show that just because it's a cheap reel doesn't mean to say it's necessarily rubbish. The ones I use a lot this is a new one actually that I haven't used yet. There we go. This is just again, it's a cheap one. It's I say cheap, it's fairly cheap. It's a WSB reel. Whoever makes their reels, I don't know whether they actually make them themselves. But again, these reels, I mean, they'll last you a couple of years. They're not going to last you forever. But then fixed spools are one of those things that when you use them in the salt water as well, I mean, they are going to eventually pack up on you. They're sort of, well, we call them coffee grinders around here simply because of the handle, you know. But they, the only thing you've got to watch for these, years ago I bought one and it was advertising the fact, you know, it was all graphite. The problem with graphite is that it flexes, and you're okay fishing normally, you get a few nice fish on it. The moment you get a really big fish and you're straining on the handle, you find the body starts to flex. And we had it with a couple of reels, they were Shakespeare ones I think, where the body flexed and then the gears slipped and it just ground all the gears off. 2 reels. As soon as you get something big, you'll notice that they'll suddenly slip on the gears. So that's the only problem with graphite, is it can be flexible. So although it doesn't rust, it can be problematic in its own way. So what reels you use is, well, is up to you really. I mean, some people like to use fixed spools more so. Some people like to use multipliers. I personally like the multiplier, but it kind of depends on what I'm doing. I mean, with fixed spools, they are, you know, you'll notice the difference if you get into a big fish, that this is going to be more of a job on a big fish than this, because this is just like a little winch, you know, it's all central, whereas this you're relying on a handle on the side and you're cranking. The other problem with these is obviously line twist. You're going to get line twist with them, and if you do a lot of casting from the shore and that, sometimes what you'll get is you'll literally cast and this will just explode because it gets so much twist on it, and then it just jams up in your rod, or you end up with a big bird's nest in your line. The way to minimise that is put a swivel on your spinner or your hook or whatever you're casting out, and that will help to reduce it. Also, what helps to reduce it, if you get bigger ones, if you use little ones like this, you get a lot more twist on it because of the size of the spool. So a bigger one will give you, it'll help. It won't stop it, but it will help. But apart from that, I mean, these are good, like I say, for doing, you know, your basic fishing, your casting, and they're very easy to use. I use them sometimes just for convenience of being able to reel in quick and cast out quick. They are probably better, I mean, these are probably better for casting. You'll get a more distance because as long as you haven't got your level winds and things on, that'll slow you down, but you'll probably get further. Apart from when you use very light lures, you'd be better off to use the fixed spool, because there'll be too much drag with a light lure. But if you're casting a fairly decent size lure or weight or whatever, you'll get a lot more distance with these. So if I was buying reels, what would I go for? What would I look for? Well, first of all, I wouldn't buy the cheapest, but then again, I wouldn't buy the most expensive reels either. I think, you know, either can be a false economy. Buying cheap, you probably end up with a rubbish reel, and it probably won't last you that long. Buying expensive, it's a lot of money, and if you do get one that's using cheaper parts than that again these days, or isn't made very well, it's a lot of money you're going to lose. And I mean, you won't find out, it'll probably break in a couple of months' time as opposed to breaking straight away. But you won't, you know, it's going to be a lot of money. Your best bet is go with sort of middle range. A lot of these ones, like this one, this, they're all middle range prices, and they've all been very reliable. And if, you know, if it lasts you a year or two and then breaks, well, you know, that's fair enough for a mid-range reel. Yet some of them, you know, they last for years. Another thing is try and avoid too many technical things on a reel. I mean, a reel is a reel. You want to be able to bring the fish in, you want the fish to be able to pull the line off need be, and you just need to be able to set it up so that when you put the rod down it'll pull off and you'll hear it, that kind of thing. If you start getting too, I mean, this has got I forgot what you call it now, the free spool, where you click that and it basically sets your spool up for you. That can be useful, but I've also found with these that they can also be a little bit of a problem when you try to tighten the drag. They don't tighten up so good as just literally a tightening spool up here, say. So there is that side to them, but they're ideal if you just put your rod down. You want to be a bit, you know, don't want to fiddle with that, or fiddle with it when you've caught a fish. You can just snap it over and away you go with it. But like I say, the more parts, the more bits you've got, elaborate pieces, there's more things to go wrong. And one thing I tend to do, and I do it with fixed spools more so than the multipliers, is when I buy a reel these days, I will open the reel up and I will pack it with grease. And this is like with the fixed spools, always packing grease in around here, give it a bit of oil up there, and then close it up, and that'll be good, and that'll protect you against dunking your reel, or just generally getting any water getting in there and causing any kind of corrosion problems, because that's what's going to be your problem in salt water. I mean, fresh water's not so bad. As far as these goes, yeah, you can pack grease in, take these off, well, this side off. You don't have to worry too much on that, because you'll be able to put a bit on the spool when you lift the spool out from there. So pack this with grease. Just watch your spindle, because if you pack grease on your spindle, you are going to cause drag. And if you want distance casting, putting grease on the spool will slow it down. So you really need to oil that more so than pack grease in there. And again, use a light grease. I mean, you can use a heavy grease around the gears or around the cogs, but generally try and use a sort of medium light grease on it, and just oil the spindle, and that will keep going. Because what you find is when you open these up quite often, the reels, they grease them, but they don't put an awful lot in there. So I've always found, like I say, if you want your reel to last, pack it. If you're using your reel for like tournaments, that kind of thing, not really fishing but casting competition, that, well, of course you're not going to have any grease in there. You're going to have literally the finest oil, and that's so you get the, you know, the best casting speed on your line and that. But if you're generally using it for fishing, particularly, mostly, like I say, in salt water, not so much fresh water, you want to get some grease in there straight away, and it will make a difference. And like I say, if you dunk the reels, get them under fresh water, flush them out, particularly around the bearings, because that's going to be your problem with these. They'll seize up on the bearings. And also another thing to watch is with these is that wheel there is always free, because if that's not spinning, then your line's going to rub on that and it will break under, you know, when you get a big fish, or it will basically cut a groove into that wheel, and then it will break your line again. You can do that if you wrap a bit of line around it, go around once and then go around again, and then pull on either side of the line. You can free them up quite often if they're a little bit sticky. And you can, if you just undo the screw there, put a bit of oil or a bit of grease in there just to keep it free. But that's your main parts you want to watch out for. These can be a bit tricky as well. Sometimes these things can get a bit, you need to take this off, put a bit of grease in there to stop these from getting stuck, because they do get stuck. I actually prefer ones with it on top as opposed to this. This is much easier because you can get to it when you're hooking a fish. You don't have to get your hand in around when there's line flying out, but it's a lot quicker to tighten that up than that. But that, you'll get a lot more pressure on that as well than these things. So if you're using a heavier line than that, you can put more power on without this pulling away or just spinning. Whereas with this, sometimes it's very hard to get them really tightened up if you need to. So anyway, there you go, that's reels. Like I say, I mean, I'm all in favour of using these old ones because, I mean, you know, they're very basic. They're made of brass or chrome brass and stainless, some of them, and they're just solid and they last for years. I mean, this is, crikey, what is this, 30, 40, 50 year old, and it still works. You know, this is, I don't know what this is, 10, 15 years old, probably 15 I would have thought, somewhere around there. And it works, again, it works fine, it's lasted, but it's not going to last an awful lot longer. You know, I mean, I do take them apart, oil them and that, and I can see it's going to run out of time at some point. So, you know, but the funny thing is anything after this that I bought with this Abu, nothing survived. They're all dead. They all died within literally months, the ones I bought after. And that's why I stopped buying those. And that's why I went down to something like this, which is cheaper. And like I say, you can buy several of these compared to one of those. And at present, I mean, there probably is good ones of these out there, but it's just having the you know, the guts to go and spend another 120 quid on one just to find out, basically. I just haven't got around to it. Maybe one day I will. And like I say, these pen ones, they're very good, boat ones. And there's probably quite a few other good boat reels out there. The ones I actually stayed away from years ago was actually Shakespeare, because I had so many problems with Shakespeare reels that I've just never bothered. And even when I've been given one, actually I took a chance a couple of years back. I bought a multiplier. I can't remember what the name of it was. It was a blue one, and it lasted 6 months. And it was, it wasn't the most, well, it was actually quite expensive. I think it was about 80 quid or something like that, 80, 90 quid. And it lasted 6 months, and then I literally just fell to pieces. And that was, and again, I hadn't used those for years, and I took a chance on one, and that's what I got, so I didn't bother. So, like I say, if you're going to go out and buy reels, probably stick with mid-range reels, you know. I mean, everybody's got their favourites. Some people have bad experiences with one reel, some with another. But if you go with mid-range, usually you get, you know, a reel that lasts long enough, and it's not going to cost you an absolute fortune. Okay, so that was a video on fishing reels. Hopefully we'll be able to get out fishing again sometime when the weather improves and make a few more videos. If you have any views on what you think is a good reel or a bad reel, stick it in the comments. It's all good information. And thanks for watching.